The Gary Trent Jr. era is over in Toronto, and it just confirms the big mistake the Raptors made with the player. Let's get into it. We already knew that this day was coming, but it is official now. Gary Trent Jr. has left the Toronto Raptors after signing with the Milwaukee Bucks. We talked about it in one of the videos last week, suggesting that the only real offer that's going to be coming Gary Trent's way is basically a vet minimum or just above that to likely sign with a contender on a prove-it sort of contract. And he's done that exactly with the Milwaukee Bucks. I think that this is a decent fit overall with the Bucks. Gary Trent is reunited with Damian Lillard. He stays in the Eastern Conference, where he suggested previously he prefers to play in the East compared to the West. But as far as the fit is concerned, yes, on the offensive end, look, okay, if he's wide open for three, he can knock down a good percentage of that. We know that. We saw that with the Raptors. But if it's not a wide open three, there's just not really a lot that he brings to the table. And I think specifically what's going to be a problem in Milwaukee is the point of attack defense, just the guard defense in general. Damian Lillard's not a good defender, and Gary Trent Jr. is not a good defender, despite what people might try to convince you of. He's not a good defender. That's going to be a bit of a problem there. I don't think that Bucks team is fantastic compared to the East that's getting better, but nonetheless, this video is focused on the Toronto Raptors side of things with Gary Trent and the mistake that was made that brought him to the team. Overall, we need to look back on this era as a mistake. The Raptors should not have done this. They should not have brought Gary Trent Jr. to the team, and we will revisit why over the course of the video today on Amateur Hour Sports, the YouTube channel completely dedicated to Toronto Raptors content. And in my new apartment today, it's a slight work in progress. I need to shore up this side a little bit more, but back on the content grind here. Thank you so much for waiting, and thank you so much for your patience. Drop a like if you enjoyed this one along the way, and subscribe to the channel as well for even more Raptors content. So let's go back to the trade that brought Gary Trent Jr. to this team. March of 2021, a delayed trade deadline as a result of the COVID-stricken season where the Raptors, things did not go very well. The team played the entire season in Tampa Bay. Every single game they played was away from home. They were coming off of a 2-seed appearance where they made the second round of the playoffs, where they lost to the Celtics in the bubble. Had it been a normal year, had Siakam not taken 3 months off over the course of the lockdown, had the Raptors been playing that Game 7 at home, maybe things go a little bit differently. But the year before that, the Raptors were NBA champions, and they were looking to strive to get back to that sort of level. But the Tampa season, everything derailed. The team was terrible. They ended up tanking. And one of the moves they made along the way, they didn't make many moves along the way, but one of the moves they did make at that 2021 NBA trade deadline was bringing in Gary Trent Jr. But in order to do that, the team had to sacrifice Norman Powell. So let's go through the thought process of the way this trade went down, and then let's talk about the output from both of those players in the 3.5 years since that trade and discuss what the Raptors were thinking and discuss potentially how bad that trade could actually look for the Raptors. So when the trade was made, it was my initial reaction was a little bit upset because Norman Powell was, first of all, a fan favorite, great player, person that embodied what the Toronto Raptors era represented, the hustle, the grind to get to that point. Like, Raptors fans were completely bought in on this team because of guys like Norman Powell, and he really took a step up that season to the point where he'd been coming off the bench for pretty much his entire career, but he was so good that season that the Raptors had basically no choice but to start him and play this small ball sort of system with Siakam at the 5, Anunoby at the 4. That got Powell at the 3, and then you had Lowry and VanVleet as the guards. It was a very small team, but Norman Powell was so good that you had no choice but to start him. And the problem was that Norman Powell was taking this bit of an ascent in a contract year. The Raptors saw the writing on the wall. They saw that this team was going nowhere. They were worried about paying Norman Powell in free agency, and they just decided, let's take a gamble on a younger player who has similar output and is likely going to be cheaper. So when the trade first initially happened, I was a bit upset about losing Norm. But then, minutes go by, time settles in, and I go, okay, I understand the thought process here. As I said, a bit of a younger version than Norman Powell. You get another shooting guard here in Gary Trent Jr. He's a lot younger than Norman Powell. Here's a player we can work on development-wise to potentially get to a point where he's better than Norman Powell, and he's likely going to be cheaper in free agency. Norman Powell was an unrestricted free agent, therefore he could go out wherever he wanted to get his next contract. Gary Trent Jr. was a restricted free agent, so there wasn't that headache and the potential of possibly losing a player for free, which became a little bit of a theme with that Raptors in the post-championship era of losing players completely for nothing. Well, here's a player the Raptors did make sure they got something out of. Although, looking back on things, Norman Powell never really wanted to leave Toronto. He felt like they were building something special, and honestly, we don't know for sure, but looking back on if the Raptors had gone into unrestricted free agency with Norman Powell, he likely would have returned. It may have cost them a little bit extra in order to make that happen, but in the end, I do feel as though Norman Powell would have returned. In the end, Gary Trent Jr. signed on a contract that was about $17 million per season. Right off the bat, the Raptors were thinking, younger player who's likely going to be cheaper. Turned out Gary Trent wasn't really all that much cheaper than Norman Powell. The Raptors probably could have just afforded to bring back Norman Powell at the same sort of cost. But the secondary thing was that it was a younger player who could maybe bring similar levels to Norman Powell, but then exceed those levels as he progresses and as he continues to develop. Well, as I've spoken about in the videos, I talked about Gary Trent. We've done a few videos in the last month or so, talk about Gary Trent. The issue with the Gary Trent Jr. era in Toronto is that the player just never got better. The player the Raptors acquired in March 2021 was largely the player they still had in the dying embers of this horrible 2023-2024 season. Yeah, there were some games where Gary Trent went off. It was a tanking team. Gary Trent was allowed to take on a lot more shots than maybe he had been used to earlier on in the season. But the season as a whole, especially considering the parts of the season where the Raptors are actually trying to win games, it was a down year for Gary Trent. And if anything, here's a player who had averaged 17, 18 points per game previously. He was averaging 13 points per game. He actually brought his numbers up as a season average later on in the season when he was getting all that playtime and all those shots when the Raptors were tanking. But it was a down year for Gary Trent Jr. It was definitely a year where he regressed rather than developed. And the thing about Gary Trent, what was exciting at the time and made this trade look phenomenal at the time. Like I remember a couple months in the trade, this looked phenomenal. Gary Trent was ascending. He had such a good end of that season with the tanking Raptors in 2021, putting up some crazy scoring performances. It was like, yes, this guy can shoot and is showing flashes of a bit of self-creation in mid-range. Now, the next levels are absolutely going to be he needs to be able to play defense and needs to be able to score at the rim. And in 3.5 years, there was one season where, he had a lot of steals and deflections. A lot of times those statistics can mask certain things defensively. What Gary Trent was doing in that season, what he still continues to do, is playing a very high-risk, high-reward defensive style. So he would gamble on passing lanes big time to get those steals and get those deflections. Yes, he would get some, but when he doesn't get it, he's completely out of position and gets burned defensively. So steals and deflections are great, but sometimes they can mask the deficiencies associated with the player. So Gary Trent, if you look at just box scores, look at all those steals and stuff. You watch him in the game, it's a good thing we have eyes. He's not a good defender. On offense, he was the best last season three-point shooter in the league on wide open threes. He was very bad when he wasn't wide open. He still can't contribute consistently enough in mid-range to make that an efficient shot. He just cannot score at the rim. Like even in transition, he is horrible in transition unless it's a wide open three, which you get a lot of in transition because the defense is not set. So overall for Trent, what ended up happening here, in 3.5 years, the Raptors got a player who was maybe slightly worse than Norman Powell, who they thought would get better, but didn't get better. So essentially the Raptors traded away Norman Powell, a player that could have returned to the team, probably would have returned to the team. They traded him away for 3.5 years of a player who was not as good as Norman Powell. And they end up letting Gary Trent leave for nothing, which kind of stinks. So it was a mistake. The trade in hindsight, looking back, hindsight's 2020, that trade absolutely was a mistake by the Raptors. At the time, Powell heading towards free agency, getting a younger player who could potentially develop, who's in restricted free agency, who, even though wasn't that much cheaper, was cheaper on a contract standpoint, the trade made sense at the time. Looking back, you can understand the thought process by the Raptors. I don't like looking at things through the hindsight lens, but if we did, absolutely, we can look back and say that trade was a mistake. However, it was not a mistake at the time, so I can forgive the front office for making that decision because, again, you can understand the pathway. You can understand the thought process to come to that decision. So in the aftermath of Gary Trent Jr. leaving, look, we've been set for this for a while, and I've been saying for pretty much an entire year now, if Gary Trent walks, we'll be okay. I thought Grady Dick should have started near the end of the season ahead of him anyways, so now The Raptors are basically forced to start Grady Dick ahead of Gary Trent because Gary Trent's not here. Jacoby Walter is a shooting guard, so now he's going to get a lot more play time this season. And I'm not expecting the world from the Raptors from a win-loss standpoint this season. So it's going to be about development. It's going to be about play time. I'm not going to use the vicious T word with this team just yet, but this is the potential to be a season that goes a little bit off the rails. So let's get the play time in for the guys we want to see develop, who actually might develop going forward, unlike Gary Trent Jr. did. I've already said my piece on Gary Trent. He made a mistake with his contract. Should have taken the one the Raptors offered him. Instead, he's taking basically a vet minimum on a prove-it contract. But I think the Raptors will be just fine. I don't think Gary Trent adds much to this team being here. I think that the 40% three-point percentage that you see is pretty fake to what he actually brings to the floor. And I think a good team that's going to be in these high-octane games, especially if they get to the playoffs, a team like the Milwaukee Bucks, like, you're going to see it a little bit more there. It's not going to be as well hidden. So we shall see for Gary Trent. So be it. Hope for the best. Wish him all the best. For the Raptors, yeah, it was a mistake looking back. It's a shame the way the situation petered out, but it is what it is. We're going to move forward. We got two shooting guards that are young and that we believe in. Let's see how far they can go, and let's see how far the team can go this season. So what do you make of Gary Trent Jr.'s tenure in Toronto? Was it a success? Was it a failure? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Also, let me know about this setup. What do you guys think of my new apartment room? Nonetheless, this is Amateur Sports. I'll see you again next time for another Raptors video. Drop a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more.